Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And it's an extraordinary privilege to join with all of my colleagues today in paying tribute to the life and legacy of the Honourable Robert James Hawke. On the 16th of May this year, of course, we lost a giant of the Labor movement, and all of us on this side of the House felt that pain. He was a bold national reformer and a much-loved Australian. I really first became aware of Bob Hawke's presence really before he was a Prime Minister. My father was at the time President of the Ironworkers Union in Newcastle, and Bob Hawke was no stranger to the workers of Newcastle and indeed the steel industry workers in particular. And in those days, the ironworkers used to invest quite a bit of time and energy into training delegates in the various industries. I remember my father convening a delegates meeting with men, and they were all men, from BHP and Lysarts and Stewart and Lloyd's, big companies that no longer exist in Newcastle, Deputy Speaker. But that was their training delegate forum, and Bob Hawke was to come in and spend 10 minutes with the delegates in this training session while he was in Newcastle doing a number of other things in his capacity as president of the ACTU then. And in typical Bob fashion, that 10 minutes stretched into, I don't know, about an hour and a half by the time he managed to speak to each and every one of those delegates and give them renewed dedication and inspiration for for the significance of the Labor movement. And as my colleague for Shorten just mentioned earlier, Bob, perhaps more than most, understood the need to build political and community alliances when you were to undergo major social and economic reform in this nation. And that is, of course, what he was always doing, in the fact that he always had time for people, regardless of the position he held, any number of minders and advisers around him that were trying to convince him otherwise, of the need to keep to certain schedules and times. Bob would always have time to stop and listen quite intently into people's stories and you know, what their passions were, what drove them, and that, of course, made him such a unique leader in the Australian political landscape. But a couple of other things I'd just like to touch on the very limited time available tonight. You know, the things that I grew to really love about Bob Hawke, he was a risk taker, and he knew the times when he had to take those big risks. And I was really privileged to, not that long ago, spend some time with Mr Bill Botel, who was at the time a health advisor to Neil Blewett in the Hawke government, who talked to me about you know, how they first dealing with the HIV/AIDS epidemic as it was unfolding in Australia, when we knew very, very little about this virus. And he went to the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke and said, you know, I'm going to need your permission to probably offend every single group in Australia and take on every vested interest. I'm going to need to be able to talk about IV drug use. I'm going to need to be able to talk about prostitution, anal sex, gay lesbian culture, you know, and we need to be able to tackle this front on. And Bob, to his great credit, understanding full well that that meant taking on, in the 1980s, the church, the police, the medical profession and indeed the media. He had the courage, he knew what was right, and he had the courage to take the risk and say, this is a public health epidemic, that's what we need to do. You need to be able to give, and gave his advisers and those people licence to then lead the world in how to actually deal with what was an unbelievable kind of epidemic at the time. So few people, it's hard to imagine whether a Prime Minister would have had the courage today to do that, indeed. I would also just like to acknowledge in this time and you know, the thankfulness that I have for Bob in his total rejection of racism and prejudice in this nation. That is something that lives with me, and I know so many members, especially on this side of the House, but certainly not exclusively. As a young anthropologist working in the field when he was a Prime Minister, his commitment to redressing the relationship that existed with First Nations people and subsequent settlers in this nation was instrumental in trying to, many years ago, 30 years ago now, through that first Barunga statement, of course, that we have here in Parliament, hanging near the members' hall, was such a radical piece, radical document at the time, yet we today still have failed to deliver the requests of that Barunga statement. I, along with Senator Pat Dodson, Malandiri McCarthy, Linda Burney, Bill Shorten, a number of us, member for Bran, last year attended the Barunga Festival the 30 years after the statement to Bob Hawke. And it was sad that the promise of a treaty all those decades ago remains elusive in Australia. We have failed to really come to terms with that, how we now seek redress to the 200-plus year colonial relationship. And but the lessons I take from that Barunga Festival 30 years down the track and Bob's passing on the 16th of May is to really redouble our efforts now. It is incumbent on all of us who sit in this chamber to do everything we can to realise his commitments, his honours to First Nations people. I'd finally just like to really acknowledge his family, and I had the deep pleasure of working with Steve Hawke on over a number of years in Fitzroy Crossing. His mum and Bob's then wife Hazel was frequent visitors there too. I send my condolences to Steve, to Roz, to Sue, who went on to do such magnificent work with Hazel around dementia later on, and of course to his later life companion, Blanche. Thank you, Bob, for your vision, your courage and compassion, your steadfast commitment to bringing Australians together, to always saying no to racism and division, to the role you took in reforming Australia to ensure we were a better Australia. We know you loved Australia, and we certainly loved you too. Vale Bob Hawke.